There is a place on this continent where the earth seems to have turned against life itself, a long, low trough of cracked salt and bare rock where the air grows so hot that it becomes a physical force, pressing on the skin like the breath of an open furnace. It is a place with a name that sounds like a warning, a name earned in blood and fear more than a century and a half ago. And it has spent all the years since living up to it. This is Death Valley, the hottest place on the surface of the earth, a valley in the California desert where the temperature climbs to heights that seem to belong to another planet, and where, in this decade, the mercury has been reaching into territory that even the people who study extreme heat did not expect to see so soon. Death Valley has always been extreme, but now it is becoming something more. A place where the records that once defined the outer limit of what our planet could produce are being approached, matched, and in some measures exceeded, in a way that has forced scientists and observers to confront an uncomfortable truth about where the climate is heading. For as long as people have kept careful track of temperatures, Death Valley has held a singular place in the imagination, the undisputed champion of heat, the location against which all other hot places are measured and found wanting. Its highest readings stand at the very top of the record books, the most extreme air temperatures ever reliably recorded anywhere on the face of the planet. To stand in the valley in the depth of summer is to experience heat in a form that most human beings will never encounter, a dry, blistering, all-consuming heat that turns the simple act of breathing into an effort and that can kill an unprepared person with startling speed. This was true generations ago, and it is true now. But what has changed, what makes this decade different, is the frequency and the persistence and the sheer scale of the extreme heat. The way the valley is now pushing toward and past thresholds that were supposed to represent the absolute ceiling, the boundary beyond which even the hottest place on Earth was not expected to go. In this video, we are going to journey into the heart of the hottest place on the planet and try to understand what is happening there and why it matters far beyond the borders of one desolate valley. We are going to explore how Death Valley came to be so extraordinarily, almost impossibly hot, the perfect and terrible combination of forces that turns this particular stretch of desert into a natural furnace unlike anywhere else on Earth. We are going to look at the records themselves, the astonishing numbers that have been recorded there, and at the new extremes of this decade that have pushed into territory nobody thought we would see so soon. We are going to understand what such heat does to the human body, why it is so lethal, and how the valley has claimed lives across its long and dangerous history. We are going to discover the almost unbelievable fact that life persists even here, in the hottest place on Earth, and what the growing heat means for the fragile creatures that call it home. And we are going to confront the largest question of all, the one that gives this story its weight, which is what it means that the planet's hottest place is growing hotter, and what that tells us about the trajectory of a warming world. Stay with us, because Death Valley is more than a curiosity, more than a record on a chart. It is a window into the extremes our planet is capable of, and a warning, written in the most brutal heat on Earth, about the direction in which we are traveling. Hashtag the anatomy of the hottest place on Earth to understand why Death Valley reaches temperatures that no other place on the planet can match. You have to understand the extraordinary and specific set of circumstances that come together there, because the valley's supremacy in heat is no accident. It is the product of a rare and potent combination of geography, elevation, and atmosphere, a set of conditions that together create a natural machine for generating and concentrating heat on a scale found nowhere else. Death Valley is not simply a hot place in a hot region. It is a place where every factor that can amplify heat aligns almost perfectly, stacking one upon another to produce the most extreme temperatures on Earth. The first and most fundamental factor is the valley's remarkable depth. Death Valley is one of the lowest places on the entire continent, a long basin whose floor lies well below sea level, sunk deep between towering mountain ranges that rise steeply on either side. This great depth matters enormously because it means the air at the valley floor is dense and heavy, compressed by the weight of the atmosphere above it, and compressed air is warmer air. As air sinks into the depths of the valley, It is squeezed and heated by the increasing pressure, arriving at the bottom hotter than it began. The valley acts as a deep bowl into which hot air pulls and settles, trapped at the lowest point of the landscape, unable to escape, growing hotter as it is compressed by its own descent. The depth of the basin is the foundation of its heat, the geological feature that sets the stage for everything else. The second factor is the shape of the valley and the mountains that enclose it. Death Valley is long and narrow, hemmed in on both sides by high, steep ranges that wall it off from the surrounding land. These mountains do more than simply contain the valley. They trap the heat within it, preventing the hot air from dispersing and blocking the cooling influences that might otherwise reach the valley floor. The steep walls also reflect and radiate heat down into the basin, and they wring the moisture out of any air that tries to cross them, so that by the time air descends into the valley, it is not only hot, but bone dry. The enclosed shape of the valley turns it into a sealed oven, a space in which the heat builds and concentrates with nowhere to go, held in place by the mountains that surround it on every side. The third factor is the dryness and the bareness of the landscape, the near total absence of the things that might moderate the heat. Death Valley is one of the driest places on the continent, receiving almost no rainfall, and its floor is a barren expanse of salt flats, sand, gravel, and rock with little vegetation and virtually no water. This matters because water and plants have a cooling effect, absorbing heat as moisture evaporates and providing shade and transpiration that temper the temperature. In Death Valley, these moderating influences are almost entirely absent. There is no moisture to evaporate and cool the air, no meaningful vegetation to provide relief. Instead, the bare ground absorbs the intense solar energy directly, heating up to scorching temperatures and radiating that heat back into the air above it. The dark, dry surface of the valley floor becomes a vast heat collector, soaking up the sun's energy all day and pouring it back into the already superheated air. And then there is the sun itself, beating down on the valley with extraordinary intensity through the clear, dry desert air. With almost no clouds to block it, and almost no moisture in the atmosphere to filter it, the solar radiation reaches the valley floor at nearly full strength, delivering an enormous load of energy to the dark, absorbent ground. Day after day through the long summer, the sun pours its heat into the valley, and with no water and no vegetation to soak up that energy in cooling ways, it goes straight into heating the ground and the air. The clear skies that make the sun so intense during the day also allow the desert to radiate some heat away at night, but in the depth of summer, the sheer quantity of heat accumulated during the day is so vast that even the nights remain punishingly warm. When you combine all of these factors, the great depth, the trapping mountains, the bare dry ground, and the intense unfiltered sun, you have the anatomy of the hottest place on Earth, a natural furnace perfected by geography to produce heat beyond anything else the planet can manage. Hashtag the numbers that defy belief. The temperatures recorded in Death Valley are so extreme that they can be difficult to comprehend, numbers that sit at the very outer edge of what the atmosphere near the ground is capable of producing. To grasp what is happening to the valley in this decade and why it is so significant, you first have to appreciate the sheer scale of the heat that the valley has long been known to generate. Because the records set there are not merely regional or national extremes, they are planetary extremes, the highest reliably measured air temperatures anywhere on the surface of the Earth, and they define the upper boundary of the known range of terrestrial heat. The most famous of these records is the reading that stands as the highest air temperature ever reliably recorded on the planet. A measurement taken in Death Valley more than a century ago that has never been surpassed by any officially accepted reading anywhere else. That number has become legendary, a benchmark of extremity, the temperature that represents the acknowledged summit of terrestrial heat. For generations, it has stood as a kind of ceiling, a mark so extreme that it seemed to belong to a bygone era of measurement, a record that might never be seriously challenged. Whether or not that historic reading was perfectly accurate by modern standards, it established Death Valley in the popular and scientific imagination as the hottest place on Earth, the holder of the ultimate record. And the valley has continued to justify that reputation in every decade since. But the single record reading, however famous, is not really the most important part of the story. What truly defines Death Valley is the consistency and the regularity of its extreme heat, the way that summer after summer it reaches temperatures that would be shocking anywhere else and that it treats as routine. The valley regularly records some of the highest reliably measured temperatures on the planet in the modern era, climbing to heights that push against the very limits of the record books. These are not freak occurrences, but the ordinary business of a Death Valley summer, a season in which the temperature soars to lethal extremes day after day, week after week. And a sustained assault of heat that no other place on Earth can consistently match. The valley does not simply hold an old record. It continues, year after year, to produce some of the most extreme heat ever measured. And it is not only the daytime highs that defy belief. Death Valley also produces some of the most extreme measures of sustained heat found anywhere, including punishingly hot nights and extraordinarily high averages over the course of the hottest months. In the depth of summer, the valley can go through periods in which the temperature never really drops to anything approaching comfort even in the darkest hours before dawn, in which the overnight lows remain higher than the daytime highs of many other hot places. The monthly average temperatures during the peak of summer reach levels that stand among the highest ever recorded anywhere on Earth for a sustained period, a measure of just how relentless and unbroken the heat becomes. It is this combination, the extreme peaks, the brutal nights, and the staggering sustained averages, that makes Death Valley not just occasionally the hottest place on Earth, but consistently, reliably, the reigning champion of terrestrial heat. And it is against this already extraordinary baseline that the new extremes of this decade must be understood. Hashtag the new extremes nobody expected. If Death Valley has always been the hottest place on Earth, then what makes this decade different? What gives this story its urgency is the way the valley has been pushing into new territory even by its own extreme standards, reaching temperatures and sustaining heat in ways that have surprised even the experts who thought they understood the limits of the place. The hottest place on the planet is getting hotter, and it is doing so in a manner that has forced a reckoning with just how far the extremes can go. Because when the ceiling of terrestrial heat begins to rise, it signals something profound about the state of the climate as a whole. For a long time, there was a sense that Death Valley's most extreme heat represented a kind of natural maximum, a boundary that the valley approached in the worst summers, but that defined the outer edge of the possible. The famous historic record seemed to mark that edge, and the assumption was that while the valley would always be brutally hot, it was unlikely to push meaningfully beyond the extremes it had already demonstrated. But that assumption has been called into question in recent years, as the valley has recorded some of its highest reliably measured temperatures in the modern era, readings that rank among the most extreme ever verified, and that have come tantalizingly and alarmingly close to the legendary all-time mark. The heat has been reaching levels that not long ago would have been considered nearly impossible, and it has been doing so not once, but repeatedly, in a pattern that suggests the ceiling itself is being pushed upward. Even more striking than the individual peak readings has been the broader intensification of the heat, the way the extreme conditions have grown more frequent, more prolonged, and more severe. The valley has been experiencing summers of extraordinary and sustained heat, seasons in which the temperature reaches its most extreme levels again and again, in which the periods of the very hottest conditions stretch longer than they used to, and in which records for sustained heat for the hottest months and the warmest nights have been set or approached. It is not simply that the valley touched a new high on a single afternoon. It is that the entire character of its summers has been shifting toward greater extremity, the heat becoming more relentless and more punishing across the whole season, so that the valley is not just occasionally spiking higher, but running hotter overall. This is what makes the new extremes so significant and so unsettling. Death Valley is not a place with much room left at the top. It was already the hottest place on Earth, already operating at the very edge of terrestrial heat, and so any further increase carries an outsized meaning. When the hottest place on the planet begins to reach temperatures nobody thought we would see this decade, it is not just a local curiosity or a new entry in the record books. It is a signal, a measurement taken at the most extreme point of the Earth's surface, telling us that the upper boundary of heat is moving, that the envelope of what is possible is expanding, and that the warming reshaping the entire climate is registering even here, at the planet's blistering summit. The new extremes in Death Valley are a kind of alarm, sounding from the hottest place on Earth, and they demand to be understood not in isolation, but as part of the larger story of a warming world. Hashtag, why the ceiling is rising. The question that naturally follows is why the hottest place on Earth should be reaching new extremes in this particular decade, and the answer lies in the way a rising global baseline interacts with a place that was already at the very top of the temperature scale. Understanding this connection is essential, because it explains how a warming that might seem modest when expressed as a global average can translate into record-approaching heat in a place like Death Valley, and why the valley's new extremes are a meaningful indicator of a broader shift rather than a random fluctuation. The fundamental driver is the long-term warming of the global climate, the steady rise in the background temperature of the planet that has been documented across the world. This warming does not affect every place equally or in the same way, but it raises the overall baseline from which local temperatures depart, shifting the entire distribution of possible temperatures upward. When the baseline rises, the extremes rise with it. A hot day in a warming climate starts from a warmer starting point and can therefore reach a higher peak, and the very hottest days, the record-setting extremes, are pushed to new heights along with everything else. In a place like Death Valley, which was already sitting at the extreme upper end of the global temperature range, even a relatively modest upward shift in the baseline can push the peaks into territory that had never been reached before, because the valley was already so close to the theoretical ceiling that any increase carries it into unprecedented ground. There is also a compounding effect that comes from the nature of extreme heat and the way small shifts in the baseline can produce outsized changes at the extremes. The hottest temperatures a place can reach depend on a chain of conditions all aligning. The right weather patterns, the right atmospheric setup, the right sequence of hot days building on one another. When the underlying baseline is warmer, each of these ingredients starts from a higher point, and when they align, the resulting peak is higher than it would have been under the old baseline. Moreover, a warmer atmosphere can lock in persistent patterns of high pressure that park over a region and trap the heat, allowing it to build day after day without relief. And these persistent heat domes, when they settle over an already superheated valley, can drive the temperatures to extraordinary heights. The warming does not just add a fixed increment to every day. It loads the dice toward the kind of extreme, prolonged, record-breaking heat events that push a place like Death Valley into new territory. And Death Valley, precisely because it is the hottest place on Earth, functions as a uniquely sensitive indicator of this rising ceiling. In a cooler place, a warming baseline might simply mean somewhat hotter summers, unpleasant but not remarkable. But in Death Valley, where the temperatures were already at the planetary maximum, the same warming pushes the readings into the realm of the unprecedented, into the territory of records that were supposed to be untouchable. This is why the valley's new extremes matter so much as a scientific and symbolic signal. They are the visible manifestation, at the most extreme point on Earth, of a warming that is affecting the entire planet, and they demonstrate that even the ultimate ceiling of terrestrial heat, the boundary that seemed fixed and permanent, is in fact rising along with everything else. When the hottest place on Earth reaches temperatures nobody thought we would see this decade, it is telling us, in the starkest possible terms, that the limits are moving, and that the warming is real, measurable, and reaching even into the planet's most extreme corners. Hashtag, what such heat does to the human body. It is one thing to speak of extreme temperatures as numbers on a chart, and quite another to understand what such heat actually does to a living human being. Because the temperatures reached in Death Valley are not merely uncomfortable or unpleasant. They are lethal, capable of killing a person with terrifying speed. And understanding why reveals the true meaning of the numbers and the true danger of the place. The human body is a remarkable machine, but it is built to operate within a narrow range of internal temperatures, and the heat of Death Valley pushes far beyond what that machine was ever designed to withstand. The human body must constantly manage its internal temperature, keeping its core within a narrow band that is compatible with life, and it does this by continuously shedding the heat it generates and the heat it absorbs from the environment. In moderate conditions, this is easy. but as the temperature of the surroundings climbs toward and beyond the temperature of the body itself, the task becomes desperately hard. In Death Valley, where the air can grow far hotter than the human body, the normal avenues of heat loss are overwhelmed. The body cannot shed heat to air that is hotter than it is. Instead, in such conditions, the air actually delivers heat to the body, and the only remaining defense is the evaporation of sweat, the one mechanism that can still provide cooling when everything else has failed. In the bone-dry air of Death Valley, sweating is at first remarkably effective because the extreme dryness allows moisture to evaporate very rapidly, carrying heat away from the skin. This is one reason a person can survive in the valley at all, at least for a time. But this evaporative cooling comes at a tremendous and unsustainable cost. To keep cool in such heat, the body must sweat at an extraordinary rate, pouring out water in enormous quantities, and in the dry desert air, this water loss can be so rapid and so hidden, evaporating instantly from the skin, that a person may not even realize how much they are losing. The result is that dehydration sets in with alarming speed. As the body loses water, its ability to sweat diminishes, and as sweating diminishes, the body's last line of defense against the heat begins to fail. A person in Death Valley without enough water to drink can move from feeling merely hot to being in mortal danger in a shockingly short span of time. When the body can no longer keep itself cool, its core temperature begins to rise. And this is where the true lethality of the heat reveals itself. The human body can tolerate only a few degrees of increase in its core temperature before serious harm sets in. As the core heats up, the early signs of heat illness appear. The weakness and dizziness and nausea and confusion that signal the body is losing its battle. If the heat stress continues and the core temperature keeps climbing, the condition progresses to heat stroke, the most severe and life-threatening form of heat illness in which the body's temperature regulation collapses entirely. In heat stroke, the core temperature soars to catastrophic levels. The organs and the brain begin to suffer damage, and without rapid cooling and medical intervention, death follows swiftly. In the extreme conditions of Death Valley, this deadly progression can unfold with frightening speed, and the confusion that comes with heat illness can be especially dangerous, because a person may lose the judgment needed to recognize their peril and seek help. The heat of Death Valley is not a hardship to be endured. It is a lethal force, and it has killed, and understanding its power over the human body is essential to understanding the danger of the hottest place on Earth. Hashtag a history written in heat and Death the Valley did not earn its ominous name by accident. Death Valley carries its grim title because of the real suffering and death that have unfolded within it across its history. A history in which the extreme heat has again and again proven fatal to those who underestimated it or were caught unprepared within its grasp. To understand the valley fully and to appreciate the danger that its rising temperatures represent, it helps to remember that this is a place with a genuine record of lethality, a landscape that has claimed lives from the earliest days of its encounter with travelers up to the present. The name itself is said to date back to the era of westward migration across the continent, when parties of travelers seeking a shortcut found themselves trapped in the brutal valley, struggling against the heat and the lack of water, some of them perishing in the attempt to cross it, others barely escaping with their lives. The valley that greeted those early travelers was a place of profound hardship and danger, a trap of heat and thirst and desolation, and the name that emerged from that experience, Death Valley, has clung to it ever since, a permanent reminder of the human cost of the place. From those earliest days, the valley established itself in the human imagination as a place where the environment could kill, where the heat was not a metaphor, but a mortal threat. In the time since, the valley has continued to claim lives, even as it has become better known, better mapped, and more visited. Every year, the extreme heat poses a serious danger to those who venture into the valley, particularly during the summer months when the temperatures reach their most lethal extremes. Visitors who underestimate the heat, who venture out without enough water, who push themselves too hard in conditions their bodies cannot handle, or who find themselves stranded when a vehicle fails, can quickly find themselves in a life-threatening situation. The very features that make the valley so extraordinary, its remoteness, its scale, its punishing heat, are the same features that make it so dangerous. Because help can be far away, and the heat can overwhelm a person before rescue arrives. The valley's reputation as a deadly place is not a relic of the distant past, but an ongoing reality, reaffirmed by the toll the heat continues to take. What makes this history of heat and death especially relevant now is the way the rising temperatures amplify the danger. As the valley pushes into new extremes, as the heat grows more intense and more prolonged, the margin for error for anyone within it grows even thinner. Conditions that were already lethal become more so. The window in which a stranded or unprepared person can survive grows shorter, and the demands on those who would rescue them grow harsher. The history of Death Valley is a history written in heat and death, a long record of the valley's power to kill, and the new extremes of this decade are, in a sense, the latest and most ominous chapter in that history, a reminder that as the hottest place on Earth grows hotter still, the danger it poses to human life grows with it. The valley has always been deadly, and it is becoming more so, and that is a sobering dimension of the story of its rising heat. Hashtag life at the edge of the possible. Given everything we have said about the lethal heat of Death Valley, it would be natural to imagine the valley as a place utterly devoid of life, a sterile wasteland where nothing can survive. And yet one of the most astonishing facts about the hottest place on Earth is that it is not lifeless at all. Against all odds, in defiance of the brutal conditions, life persists in Death Valley, a remarkable array of plants and animals that have evolved extraordinary strategies to survive in an environment that would kill an unprepared human in hours. This persistence of life at the very edge of the possible is one of the valley's most wondrous features, and it is also a dimension of the valley that the rising heat now threatens. The plants that survive in Death Valley have developed an arsenal of adaptations to cope with the heat and, just as importantly, the extreme scarcity of water that accompanies it. Some have deep root systems that reach far down in search of hidden moisture, while others spread their roots wide and shallow to capture whatever rare rainfall does fall before it evaporates. Many have small leaves or waxy coatings that reduce the loss of precious water, and some can enter a kind of dormancy during the worst of the heat, essentially shutting down and waiting out the lethal season until conditions improve. Perhaps most remarkable are the plants whose seeds can lie dormant in the parched ground for years, waiting patiently through drought and heat until a rare wet period arrives and triggers a sudden, fleeting explosion of growth, a brief flowering of life that transforms the desolate valley before the heat returns and the cycle of waiting begins again. These strategies represent millions of years of evolution honed to the specific challenge of surviving in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. The animals of Death Valley have evolved equally ingenious strategies for enduring the heat. Many of the valley's creatures survive primarily by avoiding the worst of it, becoming active only during the cooler hours of the night or the brief windows of dawn and dusk, and sheltering during the blistering day in burrows underground or in the shade of rocks and crevices, where the temperatures are far less extreme than at the exposed surface. Beneath the ground, the temperature can be dramatically cooler than the lethal air above, and this underground refuge is the key to survival for many of the valley's small animals, which wait out the deadly daytime heat in their burrows and emerge only when the danger has passed. Others have physiological adaptations that allow them to conserve water with extraordinary efficiency, extracting moisture from their food, producing highly concentrated waste, and minimizing every possible avenue of water loss, so that they can survive with almost no drinking water at all. The animals of Death Valley are masters of endurance and avoidance, creatures perfectly tuned to survive in a place that seems to permit no survival at all. Among the most extraordinary of all the valley's inhabitants are the tiny fish that survive in isolated pools and springs scattered across the desert, living relics of a wetter age when the region held lakes and rivers, now clinging to existence in small pockets of water in the midst of the driest and hottest place on the continent. These little fish, marooned in their isolated desert waters for countless generations, have adapted to conditions that would kill most other fish, tolerating warm water and harsh conditions in habitats that are tiny, fragile, and utterly dependent on the survival of their precious water source. They are among the most improbable survivors on Earth. a testament to the tenacity of life and its ability to find a foothold even in the most extreme of environments. That such delicate creatures can persist in the hottest place on the planet is a genuine marvel, and it underscores just how far life will go and how ingeniously it will adapt to survive against overwhelming odds. Hashtag when the heat threatens even the hardiest life, the persistence of life in Death Valley is a wonder, but it should not be mistaken for invulnerability, because the very creatures that have adapted so brilliantly to the valley's extreme conditions are living at the very edge of what is survivable, and that means they have little margin left to absorb further increases in the heat. This is one of the more sobering dimensions of the valley's rising temperatures, the possibility that the new extremes could push even the hardiest and most well-adapted forms of life past the limits of their endurance, threatening the remarkable web of survival that has taken millions of years to develop. The organisms of Death Valley have adapted to a particular range of extreme conditions, one that, however brutal, has remained within certain bounds over the long span of their evolution. Their strategies for survival, the burrowing, the dormancy, the water conservation, the nocturnal activity, are all calibrated to the conditions the valley has historically presented. But these adaptations have limits, and if the heat pushes beyond the range to which the creatures are tuned, if the summers grow hotter and longer than anything in their evolutionary experience, then even these masters of survival may find themselves unable to cope. An animal that shelters underground during the day depends on the burrow remaining cool enough to provide refuge, and if the heat penetrates deeper and the ground grows hotter, that refuge may fail. A plant that waits out the drought and dormancy depends on the eventual return of tolerable conditions, and if the heat and dryness intensify beyond a certain point, the wait may become fatal. The desert fish are especially vulnerable, precisely because their existence is so precarious and so dependent on the survival of their tiny water sources. These pools and springs are fragile, sustained by delicate balances of water flow and temperature, and they are acutely sensitive to changes in the climate. Rising temperatures can heat the water beyond what even these heat-tolerant fish can survive, and can accelerate the evaporation that threatens to shrink or eliminate their habitats entirely. A creature that survives in a single small pool has nowhere else to go, no other refuge to retreat to, and if that pool becomes too hot or dries up, the entire population, adapted over countless generations to that exact place, can be lost. The rising heat thus poses an existential threat to some of the most extraordinary and improbable survivors on Earth, creatures whose tenacity has carried them through the ages, but who may not be able to withstand a rapid intensification of the very conditions they have so brilliantly mastered. There is a larger lesson in this vulnerability, one that extends beyond the borders of the valley. Death Valley's living things are, in a sense, a preview of the challenge that rising heat poses to life everywhere, an especially stark example of a dynamic that is playing out across the planet. Life adapts to the conditions it experiences over long periods of time, developing strategies tuned to a particular range of temperatures and circumstances. When those conditions change faster than life can adapt, when the heat rises more quickly than evolution can respond, even the most resilient organisms can be pushed past their limits. In Death Valley, where life already exists at the absolute edge of the possible, this danger is at its most acute. But it is a danger that, in gentler forms, threatens ecosystems around the world. The valley's imperiled creatures are a warning, a demonstration of what happens when the heat rises beyond the range that even the hardiest life has learned to endure. Hashtag the strange magnetism of the hottest place for all its lethal danger, or perhaps because of it. Death Valley exerts a powerful fascination over the human imagination, drawing visitors from around the world who come to experience, however briefly and cautiously, the most extreme heat on the planet. There is something deeply compelling about standing in the hottest place on Earth, about feeling on one's own skin the force of temperatures that push against the limits of the possible. And this strange magnetism has made the valley a destination even as its heat has made it a place of genuine peril. Understanding this human relationship with the valley adds another dimension to the story of its rising temperatures. People are drawn to extremes, to the highest mountains, the deepest oceans, the most remote wildernesses. And the hottest place on Earth holds a special place in this catalog of extremity. To visit Death Valley in summer is to test oneself against one of the planet's most formidable environments, to experience heat so intense that it becomes a kind of spectacle, a natural wonder to be witnessed and carefully survived. The very extremity that makes the valley dangerous is also what makes it irresistible to a certain kind of traveler, and the rising temperatures, paradoxically, may only add to that allure as the valley's records draw ever more attention. But this fascination carries real risks, and the danger grows as the heat intensifies. Visitors drawn by the spectacle of the extreme heat can badly underestimate its lethality, venturing out into conditions that can kill far more quickly than they imagine. Lured by the desire to experience the extreme into situations that their bodies cannot safely withstand. The desire to witness the record heat can put people directly in harm's way, and every summer the valley sees visitors who push too far, who venture too far from safety, who fail to appreciate just how fast the heat can overwhelm them. As the temperatures climb to new extremes, this danger only sharpens, because the conditions that draw the crowds are the very conditions most likely to prove fatal. The strange magnetism of the hottest place on Earth is real, but it is a magnetism that must be approached with the utmost caution and respect, because the valley does not forgive those who mistake its spectacle for safety. There is, too, a deeper significance to the human fascination with Death Valley's heat, one that connects to the larger meaning of its rising temperatures. The valley has become a kind of symbol, a place where the abstract reality of extreme heat becomes tangible and visible, where people can encounter, in a concentrated form, the power of the heat that is intensifying across the world. When the hottest place on Earth reaches new extremes, it captures the public imagination in a way that abstract statistics and distant projections cannot, making the reality of a warming world vivid and immediate. In this sense, the valley serves as a powerful communicator, a place whose extreme heat and whose rising records bring home the truth of what is happening to the climate in a way that few other places can. The magnetism of Death Valley, its power to draw and to awe, gives it a special role in helping people grasp the significance of the heat that is reshaping the planet. Hashtag the valley as a natural laboratory beyond its role as a spectacle and a symbol. Death Valley serves a genuinely important scientific function as a natural laboratory for the study of extreme heat, a place where researchers can observe and measure conditions at the very edge of what the planet produces. Precisely because it is the hottest place on Earth, the valley offers a unique opportunity to understand the mechanisms of extreme heat, the behavior of the atmosphere at the upper limits of temperature, and the ways that heat interacts with the landscape and with life. As the valley pushes into new extremes, this scientific role becomes ever more valuable because the valley is showing us, in real time, what the outer boundary of terrestrial heat looks like and how it is changing. The careful measurement of temperatures in Death Valley, sustained over many years, provides an invaluable record of the most extreme conditions on Earth and how they are evolving. Because the valley sits at the top of the temperature scale, its records are of special interest for understanding the upper limits of what the atmosphere near the ground can achieve, and for tracking weather and how those limits are shifting. The valley's long history of measurement allows scientists to place the new extremes in context, to see how the recent readings compare to those of the past, and to discern the trends that reveal the influence of the broader warming. In this way, the valley functions as a kind of sentinel, a monitoring station at the planet's hottest point, whose readings carry outsized significance for understanding the trajectory of extreme heat. The valley also offers a natural setting for studying the effects of extreme heat on living things, on materials, and on physical processes, effects that are difficult to observe anywhere else because nowhere else reaches such extremes. The adaptations of the valley's plants and animals reveal how life copes at the very edge of its tolerance, offering insights into the limits of biological endurance and the strategies that make survival possible in extreme heat. The behavior of the landscape under such conditions, the way the ground heats and the air moves and the rare water behaves, illuminates the physics of extreme environments and the challenges that the heat poses to human visitors and to the equipment and infrastructure that must function there, provide practical lessons about operating in extreme heat. Lessons that grow more relevant as extreme heat becomes more common in other places around the world. This scientific value takes on a special urgency in light of the valley's rising temperatures, because the changes unfolding in Death Valley are a preview of changes that may come elsewhere. As the hottest place on Earth pushes into new territory, it offers a glimpse of conditions that other places may eventually approach. A look at what happens when heat intensifies at the extreme end of the scale. The lessons learned in the valley about the behavior of extreme heat, about its effects on life and landscape, about the limits it imposes and the dangers it presents, become part of the knowledge that humanity will need as it confronts a warming world. Death Valley, the deadliest and most extreme of places, is also one of the most instructive, a natural laboratory whose lessons are becoming more important with every record approaching summer. Hashtag a bellwether for a warming planet. We come now to the deepest meaning of Death Valley's rising temperatures, the reason this story matters far beyond the boundaries of one remote desert valley. Death Valley is a bellwether, an early and extreme indicator of a transformation that is reshaping the entire planet, and its new records are a signal that demands to be heard. When the hottest place on Earth reaches temperatures nobody thought we would see this decade, it is not an isolated curiosity, but a measurement taken at the most extreme point of the Earth's surface, a reading that tells us something profound about the direction in which the whole climate is moving. The significance lies in what the valley represents. It is the top of the temperature scale, the place that defines the upper boundary of terrestrial heat, and so it is uniquely positioned to reveal whether that boundary is shifting. If even Death Valley, already the hottest place on Earth, is pushing into new extremes, then the ceiling of what is possible is rising, and that rising ceiling is a direct consequence of the warming that is affecting every part of the planet. The valley's records are, in effect, the most extreme expression of a global phenomenon, the place where the warming registers in its most dramatic and unmistakable form. To watch the temperatures climb in Death Valley is to watch the outer edge of the possible expand, and that expansion is a warning about the trajectory of the entire climate system. There is a particular power in this signal, precisely because of the valley's extremity. Warming that might be easy to dismiss when expressed as a small change in a global average becomes impossible to ignore when it manifests as record-approaching heat in the hottest place on Earth. The valley translates the abstract into the visceral, the statistical into the tangible, showing us in the starkest possible terms that the limits are moving. And because the valley has been measured and studied for so long, and because its records are so well known, the new extremes there carry a special weight, a clarity that cuts through uncertainty and brings home the reality of a warming world. Death Valley is where the warming becomes undeniable, where the rising temperatures reach a place so extreme that their significance cannot be missed. The bellwether also carries a lesson about what lies ahead. If the hottest place on Earth is growing hotter, then the heat is intensifying at the extreme end of the scale, and that intensification is a preview of what other places may increasingly experience. The extreme heat that has always been confined to Death Valley and a handful of similar places is, in gentler forms, spreading and intensifying across the world, bringing dangerous heat to regions that never knew it, and pushing already hot places toward new extremes. Death Valley shows us where this trajectory leads at its most extreme, offering a glimpse of the kind of heat that a warming world can produce. The valley's new records are thus not just about the valley. They are about the future of heat everywhere, a warning from the planet's hottest point about the direction in which we are all traveling. Hashtag the limits and what they mean. The rising temperatures in Death Valley raise a profound and unsettling question about limits, about whether there is an upper boundary to how hot the Earth's surface can become, and what it means that we appear to be pushing against it. For a long time, the extreme heat of Death Valley seemed to define a natural maximum, a ceiling fixed by the fundamental physics of the atmosphere and the geography of the place. But as the valley reaches new extremes, we are forced to confront the possibility that this ceiling is not fixed at all, that it can rise, and that the boundaries we thought were permanent are in fact shifting beneath us. There are, of course, real physical limits to how hot the air near the ground can become, limits set by the balance of energy flowing into and out of the surface, by the properties of the atmosphere, and by the fundamental laws of physics. But within those ultimate limits, there is considerable room for the peak temperatures to rise as the overall climate warms. And Death Valley, sitting at the top of the scale, is the place where that rise becomes most visible. The new extremes in the valley suggest that we are pushing the achievable maximum higher, that the practical ceiling of terrestrial heat, the highest temperatures actually reached at the Earth's surface, is climbing along with the warming baseline. This does not mean the heat will rise without bound, but it does mean that the extremes we once thought represented the outer edge of the possible are being exceeded, and that the range of temperatures the planet can produce is expanding at the top. The meaning of this shifting ceiling extends well beyond the setting of new records. It speaks to the fundamental unpredictability that comes with pushing a complex system beyond the bounds of its historical behavior. When the extremes move into territory never before observed, the assumptions built on past experience begin to fail, and the systems and expectations calibrated to the old limits find themselves inadequate to the new reality. In Death Valley, this is starkly visible in the danger to life and to visitors, but it is emblematic of a broader challenge. The way that rising extremes everywhere undermine the assumptions on which so much of human life and infrastructure and ecology depend. The shifting ceiling of heat in Death Valley is a concentrated example of a dynamic that, in various forms, is unsettling the foundations of the climate everywhere, and there is a deeper resonance still in the idea of limits being tested at the hottest place on Earth. Death Valley has always represented an extreme, a boundary, the edge of what the planet can do in the way of heat. To see that boundary moving, to watch the edge itself advance into new territory, is to be reminded that the stability we take for granted is not guaranteed, that the limits that define our world can change. The rising temperatures in the valley are a demonstration, at the most extreme scale, that the climate is not a fixed backdrop, but a dynamic system capable of shifting into new and unfamiliar states. What is happening in Death Valley is a sign that the envelope of the possible is expanding, and that expansion, visible at the planet's hottest point, is a signal about the changing nature of the world we inhabit. #the rhythm of the furnace through the year to truly understand the heat of Death Valley and the meaning of its rising extremes. It helps to consider the rhythm of the valley through the course of a year, the way the heat builds and peaks and recedes in a cycle that governs everything about life and survival in the basin. For while the valley is famous for its summer extremes, it is not uniformly lethal throughout the year, and the shape of its annual cycle reveals both the character of its heat and the ways that the warming climate is altering the pattern that has long defined the place. Through the cooler months, Death Valley becomes something almost hospitable. A place of mild days and cool nights when the ferocious summer sun has retreated, and the basin is no longer a furnace. This is the season when most visitors come, when the valley reveals its stark and haunting beauty without the lethal danger of the summer heat, when it is possible to walk the salt flats and explore the canyons without the constant threat of the temperature. This gentler face of the valley is a reminder that its extreme heat is a seasonal phenomenon, tied to the angle of the sun and the length of the days, a thing that builds and fades with the turning of the year rather than a permanent, unchanging condition. The valley in its cool season is a different world from the valley at the height of summer, and the contrast between them is part of what makes the place so extraordinary. But as the year turns towards summer, the transformation begins, and the valley starts its climb into extremity. The days lengthen, the sun climbs higher, and the heat begins to build in the basin, accumulating day by day as the relentless solar energy pours into the ground and the trapped air. By the depth of summer, the valley has become the furnace for which it is famous. The temperatures soaring to their lethal peaks, the heat settling over the basin in an unbroken siege that stretches on through the longest and hottest months. This is the season of maximum danger, when the valley reaches the extremes that have made it legendary, and when the conditions become so severe that survival demands constant vigilance and preparation. The peak of the Death Valley summer is the hottest sustained period on the surface of the Earth, a stretch of weeks in which the planet's most extreme heat becomes the daily reality of the basin. It is within this annual cycle that the rising temperatures make themselves felt, and understanding the cycle helps clarify how the warming is changing the valley. The intensification of the heat does not mean that every day of the year is hotter in the same way. Rather, it shows up most powerfully in the extremes, in the peaks of the summer that climb toward new records, in the hottest stretches that grow longer and more severe, and in the warm season that may extend its reach, arriving earlier and lingering later. The shape of the cycle is being stretched and amplified at its hot end, the summer peaks pushing higher, and the season of extreme heat expanding, even as the fundamental rhythm of the year remains. This is how the warming registers in a place already defined by extreme heat, not by transforming the valley into something entirely new, but by pushing the existing extremes further, by making the hottest times hotter and the lethal season longer and more punishing. There is a particular significance to the way the warming concentrates in the extremes, because it is the extremes that matter most for danger and for survival. A modest increase in the average might be barely noticeable, but an increase in the peak temperatures, in the very hottest conditions the valley can produce, carries an outsized impact, pushing the readings into record territory and intensifying the lethality of the worst days. It is in the peaks that the danger lives, in the extremes that lives are lost and records are set, and it is precisely at these peaks that the warming is making itself most powerfully felt. The rhythm of the furnace through the year, then, is being reshaped in its most dangerous dimension, the summer maximum climbing toward heights that were not supposed to be reached, the annual cycle of the hottest place on Earth bending upward at its most extreme point. To watch this happen, to observe the annual furnace grow hotter at its peak, is to witness the warming of the planet expressed in the most concentrated form imaginable. The cycle that has governed Death Valley for ages is being altered, its extremes pushed further into the impossible, and in that alteration lies the story of a warming world written in the rhythm of the hottest place upon it. The furnace still cools in winter and blazes in summer, as it always has. But the blaze is growing fiercer, and the temperatures nobody thought we would see are being reached at the peak of a cycle that is tilting, year by year, toward ever greater heat. Hashtag the warning written in the hottest heat, so we arrive at the end of our journey into the hottest place on Earth, and at the meaning of the temperatures that Death Valley is reaching in this decade. Temperatures nobody thought we would see so soon. The valley has always been extreme, always the champion of heat, always a place of lethal danger and improbable survival and strange fascination. But now it is becoming something more, a place where the ceiling of terrestrial heat is visibly rising, where the records that define the outer limit of the possible are being approached and exceeded, and where the warming that is reshaping the entire planet registers in its most dramatic and unmistakable form. The story of Death Valley's rising heat is, in the end, a story about all of us, about the world we are creating and the direction in which we are traveling. The valley is a bellwether, an early and extreme indicator of a transformation that is touching every part of the planet, and its new records are a warning written in the most brutal heat on Earth. What we see in the valley, the intensifying heat, the shifting limits, the threat to even the hardiest life, the growing danger to human beings, is a concentrated and amplified version of what is happening, in gentler forms across the world. The hottest place on Earth is showing us, in the starkest possible terms, what a warming world can produce, and where the trajectory of rising heat leads at its most extreme. To pay attention to Death Valley is to take seriously the signal it is sending. When the planet's hottest place reaches temperatures that were supposed to be impossible, when the ceiling that seemed permanent begins to rise, it is telling us that the warming is real, that its effects are reaching even into the most extreme corners of the Earth, and that the limits we thought were fixed are in fact in motion. This is not a distant or abstract warning. It is a measurement, taken at the most extreme point on the planet's surface, of a change that is already underway, and it demands to be heard. Death Valley has always been a place that commands respect for the raw power of nature, and its rising temperatures command that respect anew, in a form that carries a message for the entire world. In the shimmering, lethal air of the hottest place on Earth, the future is being previewed, and the message is clear. The heat is rising, even here, even at the very summit of terrestrial temperature. And that rising heat is a sign of the changing climate that will shape the world for generations to come. Death Valley is reaching temperatures nobody thought we would see this decade, and in that fact lies both a wonder and a warning, a demonstration of the extraordinary extremes our planet is capable of, and a signal about the direction in which we are all being carried. The hottest place on Earth is speaking, in the language of record heat,